When it comes to plotting a story, it's my belief that you really shouldn't start writing until you have determined what the ending of the story is going to be. I'm a firm believer that your brain is the best computer on the planet, and that if you take the idea that you have for a particular story and let it bounce around in your brain, then eventually the story will develop itself, and when you're all set and ready, you can sit down and write it, and there's no problem plotting or figuring out what to do next or writer's block or any of that sort of stuff. I believe that when you know where you're going, then you're going to get there. A lot of times writers will have a great idea for an opening scene, but they won't know where the ending is. They won't know where they're going with it, so they'll start and then flounder. I don't do it that way. I don't even type the first word until I know how the story is going to go to an ending. Now, I may not know some of the subplots. I may not know what's going to go in between the beginning and the end, but I definitely know the ending. When I wrote the Look For Me, I Will Find You series, every book had an ending, and so that's why I thought when I wrote the first book, I thought that was it, just one book, because I knew the ending. I knew where it was going to go. Then the idea presented itself for the second, same thing. I knew what the ending was. I knew what I wanted to say, and so on. Third book, fourth book, same thing. What that means is that when I wrote the first book, I did not know the ending to the fourth book. The interesting thing about the first book is that the idea was discussed in October of 2008. The actual idea came to me on October 24, 2008, as a result of a discussion in the cemetery where we were doing some film work, and the idea was not clear. But the premise that you look around the graveyard, you see all of these gravestones, and if you accept the idea that maybe the people that are represented by those gravestones are not really dead, that they've gone on, that there is an afterlife, and then you take a leap of faith and say, well, if there's an afterlife, maybe there's a before life. Well, with that concept, the idea that maybe people do live multiple lives. Within a couple of days, I wrote some notes that I had no idea I was going to write a story. I had no clue. I knew it was an intriguing concept. And so within a couple of days, I wrote some notes that turned out to be basically the premise in a nutshell. And I didn't realize it at the time. I put those notes down. I literally let the thing cook for 2 years. There were additional discussions about it. And it wasn't until February of 2011 some events unfolded and time became available for me to write the book, so I sat down and wrote it. And I've said time and time again that it took me 20 hours to write the book. Now, that wasn't 20 hours straight. That was 20 hours in about a 2-week period. So, a couple hours at a time. I logged it. That's how come I know that it was 20 hours. Well, if you don't know where a book is going, generally you can't do that. So that's why, in my case, it was so easy. If you know where you're going, you'll get there. I even plot my short stories, my short scripts, the same way. I get the idea and I know where it's going to go, and sometimes I don't know whether it's going to be a 10-page script or 20-page script. I'm talking about for some short films scripts. I've done about 25 short film scripts, and all of those are basically little short stories. I've written a number of short stories that haven't been scripted, but it's the same process. I mean, it's just you get the ending in mind and then you go there. I think the most difficult thing for writers is to get that clear idea before they start. they tend to jump into it with 2 feet, and they go to writing, and they get this really nice beginning. Maybe they develop a character or two, but they don't know how they're going to end. To me, a story is written about an event in a person's life that is a life-changing event. I mean, it's the turning point. It's where they face some kind of adversity and they literally make it or break it. They have certain skills or abilities that are put into play that they have to use, and either they succeed or they don't. Now, I like stories where the characters grow and develop and succeed, because I'm not interested in seeing, personally not interested in seeing films and or reading stories where the characters are failures. I mean, we kind of look to literature so that we can see success. And the whole purpose of a story, I think, my view, is to encourage people, make them feel better, make them feel like they can do certain things. And so that's what I try to do with my stories. And the Look For Me, I Will Find You series is a group of books that offer a tremendous amount of hope. I continue to get readers telling me that they're very thought-provoking, and they feel good when they've read the series, and they feel like they are expanding their mind and expanding the options that they have available to them in their lives. And that's very encouraging to me, because that's kind of what I wanted it to do. I wanted these stories to make a difference in people's lives. It's not just fiction for the sake of it. It's not fiction just for strictly the entertainment value. I really do want to make a difference. And that's true of virtually all of my writing. There's always a statement. The Look For Me, I Will Find You series is no different. There's a statement, a very powerful statement. And I'm finding, too, now that people are literally debating the statement that's being made. And I like that, too, because the more you think about things, the more you talk about things, the more you're going to grow individually. And that's a good thing. So when people plot stories, maybe some writers just plot for the purpose of strictly entertainment. They don't want to change anything. They just want to take a set of circumstances and some characters and put them into a situation and get them out, just so that the reader will not pay attention to his own life or not be worried about things. It's just an escape, just entertainment. And that's great. I think writers that do that have a wonderful skill. But I don't do that. That's not my calling. My calling is to change the world, to make a difference in the world. It's always been that way. Everything that I've done has been that way, and so I'm totally pleased that people are now coming to me telling me that that's what these books are doing for them. And I think it's because the plot is so engaging. It expands as you read through the series. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and as I've said, you get to the point where you recognize there's infinite possibilities. I continue to tell people, I'm done. 4 books is all I'm going to write on this. But I know that the possibilities are just endless. I can take these same characters in a dozen different directions, and there's the potential of a lot of new characters, all interlinked. Now, something that I think is important when you plot something is when you make a statement, it needs to be important. You don't just put things in there for the fun of it. Alfred Hitchcock used to call them the red herring. Put in something that doesn't mean anything to throw the audience off. I mean, you do that sometimes, for sure. It's a good device, but I like to, when I put something into a story, I like to pay it off later. I like to have a reason for it, and there's a few things like that in some of the subplots that, as the reader is engaged, he begins to wonder, well, what's going to happen with that? And my idea is to make his mind wander and make him try to figure out where we're going. I like it when readers come back to me and say, boy, that had a lot of twists. There were turns that I didn't expect. Well, as long as the turns are fair, in other words, not writer's convenience, but the turns were properly foreshadowed so that when you get there, you realize, that writer told me that. I didn't realize where it was going, but wow, that's where it went. That's okay. I don't like a writer that just, all of a sudden in a plot you need something, so he just creates it and puts it there. No, it needs to be within the realm of possibility, even though some of the things that can be totally fantastic. I mean, we can suspend reality, but within the suspension of that reality, things still have to make sense. They can't be just completely illogical. And that's one of the things that when you're plotting, it's important to remember the world that you're in. I've said over and over that I'm not real sure how I was able to do all of this, because I got into this world and I didn't really do it on purpose. I mean, the premise came to me based upon that discussion, and the premise mulled around for 2 years, again because of that discussion and further discussion along those lines. But I didn't know for sure where this thing was going. Now, that being said, I knew the ending before I started writing each individual book. But I sure as heck didn't know when I wrote book 1 that there would even be a book 4, much less the ending of book 4. One of the things that I do when I plot a book, I really depend on the brain to do the work. I get to where I know my characters, I know what they're likely to do, what they're likely to say. As I've said in my previous discussion on dialogue is easy. I don't know why. I've listened to enough people over the years. I know what language is, at least the English language and the current vernacular. I'm not pretending to use the vernacular that was used in 1014 or 1025 or 1637. I'm not pretending to use words that they would have used back then. I'm using current language. The dialogue comes easy that way, and I suppose if you wanted to, you could go back and change all of that and put it in the local period vernacular. But I think that would detract from the whole story. But anyway, when I get ready to plot something, I know where I'm going, I know my characters, I know how they behave, what they say, how they talk. And I'll take a little notebook and really, just like on 2 pages of the notebook, I will draw a flow chart of what happens to each of the characters, and I'll draw little boxes and I'll put events in those boxes, and then I'll draw arrows to other boxes. And then that starts over on the left-hand side of the page, and then as it goes across to the right-hand side of the page, it develops. And I generally know pretty much the whole thing before I do very much writing. I'll make changes. There will be some things that develop. But I do know where I'm going. And I think that makes it so much easier to get there. I use that business of writing it in the notebook. Sometimes I'll write a timeline. With the Look For Me series, I did write a timeline. I want to know how long these guys live and how they connect up and all that sort of stuff. I also write down their names and sometimes a character description. Sometimes I don't. I mean, sometimes I know these guys so well, for some reason, I don't need to put down a character description. I see them. And that's where the old, is it memory or imagination thing, I mean, it's like I know these people. And I don't know why that is. So I don't necessarily write down anything about them. It's just most of their personality is revealed through what they say. But that technique of a flow diagram, other writers may or may not use it. I don't know. I've never really sat down and talked to another novelist to find out how he or she does that kind of work. I imagine people do outlines and flow diagrams, and maybe they just in longhand they'll put down basic plot points or something. I don't really know. I'm sure that there are very similar techniques used by lots of different novelists. To me, the plot really carries the story. Well, the plot is the story. It carries it if it's unfolding as you go, and if there are questions, if there's a little bit of danger and or uncertainty. I like to put that at the end of my chapters so that the reader will want to start the next chapter. I've always done it that way. That's just it just comes natural to me. I don't know why. Maybe that's the reason people say, "Oh, well, these books are page turners." Well, maybe that's it. You're busy. You know you can read for 30 minutes and you get to the end of a chapter, but you're really anxious to see what happens, so you read another 30 minutes. And that's where some of my readers are coming back to me saying, "Gosh, man, I read 2 books in one sitting." That blows my mind. It takes about 4 or 5 hours to read one of these books if you just go straight through. And that's how long it takes me to read it. So that would be, I'm kind of an average reader, I guess. Some people have said they've read the books in 3 hours. Others, they take weeks, but that's fine. I mean, if it takes you weeks to read the story, that means you're enjoying it for weeks, I hope. So plotting is a very essential thing. I tend to do a lot of it in my head, in the brain. Just let the brain work. Put all the details, put the premise in there, put the characters in there, have some sense of who they are and what the dialogue is, know the ending, where it's going, and put that in your brain and just let it cook. And eventually, then the brain will say, "Okay, I'm ready to write." And that's the way I've done these. Like the 4th book, I finished Missing You in August of 2011. And I was very confident that I had finished the series. Very confident. And a number of people kept asking me, "Well, is there going to be a book 4?" And I said, "No, I'm finished. There's not going to be a book 4." Well, then an idea came to me, and it stewed around, and I didn't really sit down and write anything on it until late December. And then by the middle of January, it was done. So a couple of weeks, total number of hours. I didn't log it this time, but total number of hours couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 hours to write the book. That's pretty typical. Then once a book is written, there's a lot of edits. They're not major edits, just correcting spelling and quotation marks and things like that. And I'm very fortunate to have someone that is real good at editing. And she'll come back and look at all that stuff and, find my spelling errors and my inconsistencies in my spelling, that sort of stuff. But very little plot change in the editing process. And I'll go through a typical book. Say it takes me 14 or 15 sittings to write the book. Maybe about a 2-hour sitting each time. So 14 or 15 sittings, that's 2 weeks. Assuming I can write every day. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. It depends on what else I'm doing. Because I'm literally stealing the time from my regular work in order to write these. Well, after those 14 or 15 sittings writing the book, then I'll go through it another, 4 or 5 times, just reading it from one end to the other to find any inconsistencies and or correct grammar and spelling. And then with the assistance of my editor, then we'll end up going through it maybe, sometimes I'll have like a version 30, which means a version 30 means that I've sat down at the computer 30 times. 15 times maybe to write it, and then another 15 times to correct spelling, commas, that sort of stuff. And sometimes that's very minor. But as we go through it, we find more and more stuff. And of course, the nightmare is that once something gets printed, then the errors are obvious. It's a funny thing. The errors seem to wait until the printing before they jump out at you. But and you read all kinds of books that just have errors in them, and I know mine do as well. And every time I read it, I find something else. So eventually, we try to get that all corrected. But at some point, you have to stop and move on. So plotting is fun. It's the simple answer to how do you plot is come up with a premise, an idea, figure out where you're going with it, make sure you know the ending before you write, and then sit down and write it.